It's a city that's hosted all sorts of parties.
But it's never seen anything like this.
We're really excited, and we cannot wait to showcase Milwaukee to the world.
50,000 people are coming to town.
That's a great bump to the economy, obviously.
Those who aren't coming will be watching.
We have a chance to showcase Milwaukee.
History will be made.
We have an opportunity, all of us do, to help Milwaukee to shine.
And we're making sure you're ready.
This is Conventional Wisdom.
Hello, and once again, welcome to Conventional Wisdom, the podcast getting you ready for the Republican National Convention here in Milwaukee. Shall we begin this episode with a quiz? What do John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, and Teddy Roosevelt all have in common?
Oh, I know. All of them replaced their former bosses who, not to be sad and morbid, but they all died.
They died on the job, right?
They did.
And they became vice president. 15 vice presidents have become presidents in one way or another since John Adams replaced George Washington. But for every LBJ and Harry Truman, there are plenty of Henry Wilsons, George Clintons, and William Wheelers who are apparently lost to the dust of history.
So on this episode, which we call Vice Maybe.
Vice Maybe.
You had to do it. I knew you had to do it. I knew you. We're looking at what picking a running mate does for a candidate's chances at winning.
That's right. And we're joined by Marquette University professor Julie Azari and UWM professor Emeritus Mordecai Lee. Welcome to you both. This is, I don't know if anyone in this podcast room knows who it's going to be. Donald Trump says he knows at this point. But can we all agree it'll be the most interesting unveiling of a vice president, a la The Apprentice, getting 5 people up on stage, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're out, you're it. I don't think it'll be like that, but there'll be some drama to it.
Without a doubt. And we've heard from the campaign, Donald Trump's campaign, that he is picking the vice president at the convention, which hasn't happened in quite some time. Mordecai, this is a rarity, or at least it has been in the modern era of politics.
Right. In our lifetime, generally speaking, the vice presidential candidate is picked ahead of the convention so that, it's taken care of. Because a lot of people remember that there was a fight on the floor of the convention in 1944, who would be the vice presidential running mate for FDR, who was running for his 4th term. And FDR at the last minute dumped his vice president, Mr. Wallace, Henry A. Wallace, and picked, who do you pick? Harry Truman. Mm-hmm. And Harry Truman became president. So now they just don't want a floor fight.
Professor Azari, do you agree that this is going to be an interesting unveiling?
I mean, it seems likely it'll be an interesting unveiling. It wasn't especially an interesting unveiling in 2016. So there have been these moments where we kind of expect Trump to zig and do something unusual, and then he zags and does a pretty standard Republican thing. So that's, I'm not really sure. But I think that's what's intended to be kind of generated by this idea that it'll be announced at the convention. If that's the case, then certainly that'll be a major news story coming out of the convention. And one of the things that people complain about going into conventions is they're so scripted, they're so boring, they're so predictable. And so to have something actually happen, something that will both be interesting for people there, but also interesting on television, I think would be quite remarkable if indeed it plays out that way.
Looking back on presidential races in our past, it wasn't always this way. For many, many years, the vice presidential nominee was selected and announced there at the convention. It's changed. Professor Azari, why did things change in your perspective? Why did it become kind of the modern day announcing a few days before, even 2 weeks before in some cases?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of that is to sort of take the controversy out of the convention moment. To allow the kind of vice presidential candidate to have their media moment beforehand, draw that attention in, let everyone have their conversation, and then pull all that attention back to the presidential nominee once the convention begins. The kind of conventional wisdom, pun intended, for modern contemporary conventions is that it's all about coming together behind that nominee and highlighting the nominee and kind of bringing the party together rather than like highlighting different different potential fissures and the different kind of ins and outs of the vice president's background. So I think that's part of what's driving that practice.
And they're all being vetted, right? I mean, they've been vetted for a very long time. Certainly since Thomas Eagleton was picked right in 72 for McGovern, right?
Right.
And then it was discovered, well, he'd had electric shock therapy and had depression, which was not as socially acceptable as it is now. In fact, it was quite a disqualifier. But can you vet everything, Mordecai?
One of the reasons that I think we've seen some vice presidential nominees who ran against the eventual nominee is because that's a kind of a vetting process. So Obama picks Biden.
You're right.
Why? Because Biden was running for president the same year he was. The media went over his life millimeter by millimeter. So it was a safe kind of choice. And that's why we see things like that. The risk right now is that if Mr. Trump picks somebody sort of out of the blue, there might be something in the person's background they didn't have time to vet. And that's something you want to really avoid.
Potential skeletons in the closet is what you're saying, right?
Oh, yeah.
Are you surprised, Mordecai, that Donald Trump has vowed to go this route this year?
I'll tell you, I'm not surprised because he's such a unique politician in our lifetimes. He's such a showman. He understands showbiz. He knows how to hold everybody's attention. And so for him to build up the drama, and then even the tease, I already know who it is, but I'm not telling you. Sure. And if somebody tells you that I said, they'll be wrong. So he's really good at getting the attention. The thing that is probably going to be striking is that he was so effective on television that he really treats politics as TV. And TV is a really visual medium. And sometimes in his first administration, he would say, well, that person doesn't look like a fill in the blank. In other words, he wanted somebody to look like whatever the role he was picking. So it's almost like a casting call,
right.
A Hollywood casting call. Who would look like a vice president? Pence looked like a vice president, real straightforward, evangelical Christian. And so he fit in the bill.
And from Indiana, which is the highway of vice presidents, so many have come from there. Professor Azari, before we get to the modern picks here of who he may or may not go with, in history, is there a VP pick that jumps out at you saying, brilliant choice or ridiculous choice? I'm surely you studied this and how much they can or cannot sway an election, but who was the most brilliant one? I guess I have to go LBJ to JFK just to get that Texas Democrat vote.
Sure. I mean, I think I belong to kind of a school of thought among political scientists that's a little bit skeptical of the electoral impact of a vice president. So I might go with, this is a great question. Actually, I don't think anyone's ever asked me this question. I'm going to go with, from kind of an impactful pick, actually Carter's selection of Walter Mondale. Mondale, however you feel about his politics, was someone who was actually really had kind of a vision of what the vice presidency could be and really changed the role of the modern vice presidency in governing. So that was, if nothing else, certainly a really kind of impactful pick that made a difference for a long time. And
he was the Senate insider, and you had Carter, who was in Washington outsider to the nth degree. So he had somebody on Capitol Hill that could work the room.
Yes, sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. Mondale, much more of a sort of classical liberal from a kind of New Deal liberal political tradition than Carter was. So, those typical balancing elements in that pick.
Mordecai, let's toss the same question to you.
Well, it was Eisenhower who, out of the blue, picked Nixon. Nixon was a U.S. senator, and before that, he was a member of Congress. He was sort of a rising star in the Republican Party. He was from way out in California. I mean, remember those days? California was far away. It was days away. And so I think what Eisenhower was trying to do is he wanted to have the perfect balance. He wanted to have age balance because Nixon was young. He wanted to have geographical balance, and he wanted to have ideological balance. And so that was an instantaneous hit.
Do you think that vice presidents help or can hurt more when it comes to picks?
Oh, that's the greatest question for this subject, because I think for Trump, he doesn't want anybody who's a star, anybody who will outshine him. And somebody who will not engage in a gaffe, the way Spiro Agnew occasionally would have malapropisms. So I think it's going to be a kind of a second-tier vice president as opposed to a star of a vice president.
Professor, same question to you. You alluded a few moments ago to the fact that you're not a big believer in the electoral poll of a VP, but can one hurt you? Did Sarah Palin in the long run hurt John McCain, for example, after making such a positive first initial splash?
Yeah, I think that there's some evidence that that's the case. I think that's there's a definite asymmetry here, to use a kind of social sciencey word. We definitely see that the vice presidential candidate can hurt. They can hurt in ways kind of like Palin, where you get a kind of narrative: this person isn't ready to step into the presidency. This person's not ready. They're not prepared. They're not qualified. It can be someone who's kind of off of where the electorate is at ideologically. And so there's a number of ways that that person can damage the ticket. I think the main way, though, is that it shows that the presidential candidate doesn't have solid judgment. So I'm riffing on a book here about what voters actually think about vice presidential picks. And the answer is mostly not much. But one thing that can happen is if someone picks a candidate that seems unqualified or, off the median ideology, what have you, that person then kind of reflects on, well, how does this president make decisions? How does this candidate think about difficult decisions? Do they really weigh all the factors? Do they have good judgment? And that can harm voter perception. And for what it's worth, Nixon was kind of like my second, one of my second choices for the best VP pick. I think that's a good answer as well.
You guys are on the same page, it seems. When it comes to Donald Trump and talking about the fact that he knows who he's going to pick, right? That just came out just a few days ago. Do we find it odd that nothing has, quote unquote, leaked at this point? Do you think that he's just keeping his cards very close to his chest, Professor Azari? Or do you think that a very small circle of people actually know at this point? Has he been in battle against the campaign? He wants somebody, maybe the campaign wants somebody different, and that's why we've kind of been waiting for so long and will continue to wait for so long. What do you think?
We do see, when we hear about these processes afterward, that there's inevitably going to be some tension, that presidential candidates will tend toward people who they sort of see themselves reflected in some way or who they personally like. The campaign may have a different vision. The party may have yet another vision. So there's really three actors there. And that's sort of like, I think, not taking this out of any kind of Trump 2024 context, that's the simplest explanation, I would think, for why we don't have any leaks coming out yet, is that they don't know. They're still vetting. They're still arguing. They're still deliberating. This is pretty typical, I think, and especially if this election is going to happen on the 17th or 18th of July or whenever we're looking at, and we have a couple of weeks, and so this would be pretty early to have a decision made and not announced.
Because it really would take the steam out of the convention. If you promised you're going to do it at the convention, you do it early. It's like, all right, well, what are we going to do on Monday and Tuesday of convention week? John Nance Gardner, who was FDR's, you know where I'm going with this, called the vice presidency a warm bucket of spit. Some people think that was a cleaned up version of what he really said. So you got to want the job, first of all. As we tape this on Wednesday, the 26th, J.D. Vance came out today and said, yeah, I want the job and I hope to get it, which is almost rare to hear somebody say, I want that job. You're supposed to act a little bit with more humility. But we have to factor in the age. Joe Biden was the oldest elected president back in 2020. If Donald Trump wins in November, he will be the oldest elected president. So age is a factor here. Does that mean this pick weighs more than your pick when the candidate is in his 50s or her 60s, for example?
It's hard to tell how Donald Trump would go through this process because each of the things we've been talking about is a kind of a click. Okay, how about that? Then now let's think about this. I'm not sure that he'll do conventional thinking of, I'm in my late 70s, I should pick somebody who's in his or her 50s or 60s. He's so unorthodox about all traditional politics that it's hard to know. When you talk about, for example, John Nance Gardner, that was the same as Lyndon Johnson, where FDR needed to win Texas to become president. So he picked Gardner, who was running against him, who was one of his opponents in 1932. So for Trump to, let's say, think of somebody who was in the race this year, he would know that they're safe politically, but he doesn't like them. He's not a guy who, think of what Biden did. Think of what Obama did, when they were willing to bury the hatchet with people. So it's hard to predict what Trump would do. All I can say is I think it'll surprise us.
I can't wait for it. Because at the end of the day, we've had a Trump-Biden show-off before, right? We've had this happen before. And so when it comes to the convention time, the nominee's already selected. Donald Trump in the past hasn't decided on a platform. So what really happens during the convention? It's almost like he's trying to utilize that and utilize this VP pick to make people watch, to make people stay entertained and to tune in, right?
He is so shrewd. He is so intuitive about politics and show business.
Professor, I want to ask you the same question about age of the guys at the top of the ticket. Does that make this pick more substantial, more important?
I think it certainly makes it more of a focal point for media attention. And that's, I think, what drives a lot of the significance of both the convention and the vice presidential pick is sort of like, what are the stories that are then going to be told between July and November? And that certainly was a factor in the Palin-McCain situation, which I remain obsessed with 16 years later. I think that certainly will be something that people talk about. Is that something Trump is thinking about? I really don't know. And I don't know if I'm as as positive on all of Trump's political instincts as the other guest. I'll offer a kind of different perspective there. And also that I think that counterintuitively, there's evidence that when it comes to these kinds of decisions, that Trump is kind of listening to other people and receiving pressure, certainly, from the party. And now it's a very Trumpified Republican Party where people largely agree with him and like him and kind of are in tune with his direction in the party. But that doesn't mean that there isn't pressure to pick a certain kind of person, whether that's someone who's young or someone who represents a pivotal constituency or state, whether that's someone who is a more traditional politician and Trump is trying to pull in the other direction. I wouldn't be surprised if some of that, again, is still kind of going on in the background there. And so it will certainly be interesting to see what happens going forward.
Not that this holds any weight or you have any sort of inside knowledge. I ask you this question just honestly to get your perspective. Who or what type of person do you think, female, male, where they're from, what sort of position they currently hold, who should he pick to have the best chance at winning?
So again, I don't really think it matters that much. I think whatever happens, this will be a pretty minimal kind of factor in whether Trump wins or who votes for him. But I think that probably what he'll do, I think we're probably looking at someone who has a lot of kind of traditional, who looks like a traditional vice president, maybe not quite as much as Mike Pence. That would be hard to replicate, but maybe similar. So I think we're all on the fence about whether we want to make a prediction, but someone like Doug Burgum, and specifically someone who doesn't really have their own political base or their own kind of independent political backing. I think that's the kind of person Trump will pick, someone who really depends on him for their political career on the national stage.
Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, we should point out, but if you're listening at this point, you probably know who Doug Burgum is. If you're listening to a podcast about vice presidents, I'm pretty sure you know who Doug Burgum is.
And he also ran against Trump, of course, obviously in the beginning here.
And he tore his Achilles on Marquette's campus
He
playing
did.
basketball during the debate last year. So
when you think about what Trump's logic will be, I think there are only two factors. One is I want somebody loyal, all the way down the line. That's why he loved Pence until January 6th.
Right.
So one is I want loyalty, and one is I want somebody to stay in the shadow. I don't want to be overshadowed by anybody. I don't want anybody coming out in front of me, and I certainly don't want somebody arguing with me. So I think that makes the short list that we've been seeing in the media recently probably about right.
Well, that makes Doug Burgum a pick because he's not a flashy guy. It's not a knock on him at all. He's a governor. He's a successful businessman. He's done well. He's personal on a smaller level, but he's never wowed the crowd. Go ahead.
But on the other hand, he was successful in business.
Sure.
He could be the kind of person who says, screw you, I'm walking away. In other words, he would have the sense of independence that he doesn't have to stay in the office.
Much like the first Secretary of State, whose name escapes me right now, that Trump picked.
Oh, yeah, from Exxon.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, none of us.
I like it's on the tip of my tongue.
And we'll put Anthony on that. We'll get him
Yeah,
on
the Exxon guy.
Okay.
When it comes to timing of this whole thing, we know the RNC is going to last 4 days. We know that delegates are going to be in town the week before that. Not exactly sure when the Trump carousel is going to be coming into town. Probably Sunday, maybe even Monday at some point. Timing for this announcement, if it does happen at the convention, which again, we believe it's going to because we've been told by the CEO of the Republican National Committee that it's going to, but does it happen Tuesday? Does it wait all the way until Wednesday when the VP typically speaks on the night before the big prime time address by the nominee on Thursday?
If he wants to hold off to the last minute, then I think it would be late on the second day. In other words, it would be in prime time, all of America is watching, and he announces it. But it can't be on the third day because whoever becomes the vice presidential nominee needs time to help write a speech, to help prepare oneself, to practice the speech. So I think there has to be, at a minimum, 24 hours between the announcement and the second to last night.
Can I tell you why it won't be the second night?
Okay.
This is a logistics thing. It's the night of the All-Star game.
Oh!
And a lot of Americans, although baseball does not have the pull at one stud, I think if you say you want to watch a baseball game or you want to watch a convention, they're going to say...
And Trump's aware of that sort of thing.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
very in tune with that.
Exactly. Can we just throw out some names and get your plus minus initial pros and cons? Because there are 3 names on the list. We talked about Doug Burgum already. J.D. Vance of Ohio is a guy who said he wants the job. First-term senator, wrote a very popular book, Hillbilly Elegy. Professor Azari, will start with you. Pros and cons.
Sure. J.D. Vance is an interesting one on the loyalty front. He's been very loyal to Trump recently, but he kind of made his name actually as a sort of spokesperson for deciphering the Trump phenomenon through a much more kind of critical lens. I think that in that sense, it's unclear to me. The one criteria I think is important because it's very similar to what my fellow guest said, the kind of loyalty and does that person have any sort of their own independence? That makes Vance almost a really complicated case of that. Certainly, he sort of looks like what you expect of a vice presidential candidate to look like. He's from Ohio. He's a senator. He's a relatively new senator, quite new senator. So those are sort of, I think, pros and cons. He's a very conventional candidate. There's a lot of media already on him. He's well known. But I think that's sort of, in some ways he's the possibility I feel the most ambivalent about in terms of what he would bring to the table.
Interesting. I know you mentioned Doug Burgum. Is that who you think might have the best chance, at least from the names that we know? Again, This is just what's kind of come out, right? It could be somebody totally off center that we haven't even been speaking about for the last year.
This is where I lean. Yeah, is Burgum for sort of those reasons. He very much looks the part, and he has a conventional kind of political job. He doesn't have a lot of national reputation or background on his own. So I think that's sort of where I would lean. And his name's kind of been floating around out there.
Yeah, he's one of the 3. And the other 3, by the way, Rex Tillerson, thanks to our producer, Anthony. Rex Tillerson was the Secretary of State who kind of said, I'm out of here on that. And the third name, Marco Rubio, comes up a lot. There's a constitutional question that Florida delegates couldn't vote for him because they're from the same state, but there's a workaround on that, of course. Pros and cons of both. And Professor Lee, we'll start with you.
Well, both in terms of Vance and Rubio, they would be viewed by the media as the next Republican candidate for president. In other words, they're the rising star. Because if Mr. Trump wins this election, he's term limited. So the 2028 election will start with either J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio. And I think the media frenzy around the two of them will really bother Donald Trump. He does not want that. He wants a very quiet vice president.
If you mention 2028 election one more time,
I know.
You're getting coffee.
My head almost exploded.
You're getting coffee poured on your newly pressed shirt. Just going to say that. My head almost exploded.
I think that it would behoove him to potentially pick a woman. I don't know if he ever would pick a woman, and I know that she has strayed very far from Trump and his politics, but now has started to come back. But I think Nikki Haley's name shouldn't be forgotten about. I know that she's a rising star in the Republican Party. I can certainly see her at some point running for president herself, as she just has, of course. But I think that there's a reason she's starting to kind of come back to his side.
I agree with you. Why, guys, is that name not being tossed around more? Professor Azari, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this loyalty thing. She ran against him in the nomination battle, and it wasn't just, she was also on the stage. She really ran against him. I want to say about the question of a woman vice presidential nominee, because it's still relatively rare, that concept will kind of suck all the air out of the room. And so I think this is where we get at that tension in the candidate, the party, the campaign. On the one hand, that can be really attractive. Like, that will be the news story is, well, this is a woman. This is only the second woman nominated to a Republican ticket. How will this compare with Sarah Palin? Whatever, what have you. How does it compare with Kamala Harris? And I think that draws a lot of media attention. I think that's attractive to campaigns and parties, especially as the Republican Party looks to how do they appeal to more women voters. I think that's not necessarily attractive to Trump. He wants to be the subject of the media coverage. And I think that's where we see Trump's sort of unusual characteristics as a presidential candidate come out. And so that, even aside Haley's baggage of having run against him for the nomination in 2024, I think that also kind of comes out. I think that's a knock against candidates who don't fit the traditional demographic profile, that they will draw away media attention from Trump himself.
It's the same storyline that Professor Lee just mentioned, that the young and uprising star, they become the center of attention, which all then points us back more to Doug Burgum as we go on and on. A guy's not going to steal the thunder. But you mentioned all three of these guys that we mentioned and Nikki Haley. There are all sound clips of all of them saying very disparaging things about Donald Trump. They may have come back and are in his corner, but you know how campaign and political ads work. They're not necessarily honest or, of the most updated information. So those clips will play over and over again. Marco Rubio calling him a con man. Doug Burgum said he's not a guy I would do business with. J.D. Vance said I've been against him from the beginning. All these things, the internet lives on forever. It's written in ink, not in pencil. So all of these people have that certain baggage of not being loyal to him at one point.
Right. And taking off from Stephanie's point, it doesn't have to be Nikki Haley. There are a lot of senior women in the Republican Party, very experienced. There's the governor of South Dakota, or is it North Dakota?
Christy Holmes.
Right. There's Marsha Blackburn, who I think is from Tennessee. There's the governor of Iowa. There's the governor of, I think it's Alabama. There are a lot of women in the Republican Party. And so, for example, he could pick a woman who, let's say, is not a rising star, a woman who became the governor of such and such a state or U.S. senator. Maybe she's 60-ish, 65-ish. That's a woman, but it's not competition.
Kim Reynolds is the governor of Iowa, who is immensely popular in the Mordecai state. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be a surprise to all of us, and I think that's what makes politics fun, right? I mean, this modern day politics, I have to say, over the last 12 years has been entertaining. Whether you like it or not, it's at least been something to watch and something to pay attention to versus just like, oh yeah, that stuff in Washington.
I mean, I'm so old that I remember when people used to say, this is back in the 70s and 80s, that there isn't a dime's worth of difference between the parties. One of them is Tweedledee and one of them is Tweedledum or Tweedledummer. Now you can't say that. So it's exactly what you said.
Okay. Final thoughts. Anything we haven't asked either one of you, Professor Azari, Professor Lee, anything that you think our listeners should have some insight on? Anything you're thinking about? Who wants to go first on this one?
Well, go ahead. I'm running out of opinions.
I never thought we'd hear you say that, to be honest with you.
I think we've covered the waterfront.
Professor Azari?
Yeah, I think so. The thing I would leave everybody with is just to think about, obviously, the individuals and who Trump is as a person, who all these different candidates are as people, but also kind of think about this as a group process and think about, who's weighing in on it and how maybe does this reflect how Trump, his campaign, and other actors in the Republican Party are thinking about their coalition and thinking about going forward in November. And I think if you kind of broaden out your questions, you can make this, even more interesting than it already is.
All right.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Thank you to both of you for taking the time out of your day to kind of just give us your perspectives. That's what we're looking for here. And this is what makes this podcast so great, is that we get to have these long conversations and not just listen to you in 30-second sound bites.
I just had a fun conversation about vice presidents, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say.
Ditto.
Okay. Conventional wisdom is not done. It's done from this studio here at Fox 6, but the week of the next time you will see us, we will be down at Fiserv Forum in our cubicle, which is about half the size of this table, I'm told, right?
So, yeah, and it costs, well, I won't give you the number, but
don't give the numbers,
it's a lot. Our bosses keep telling us.
Here's what we need to know. Deodorant and breath mints are a must for that week.
We're only going to be offending each other,
yes.
so.
Thank you both very, very much. Insightful, fun, logical. Can't wait to see who's right and who's wrong. And we'll bet a lunch on it like we always do. All right.
This has been Conventional Wisdom. Vice, maybe. We shall see what happens. We have 2 weeks until the RNC, and we'll see you then.